Last year, the UK saw a record level of net migration, 600,000 people, and although it was an exceptional year with the war in Ukraine, it is forecast to remain above pre-Brexit levels until at least 2026. Last year was also a year of record rent increases and chronic housing unaffordability, given the UK's inability to build anywhere near enough homes. To what extent is immigration responsible for the UK's housing crisis? And if we wish to make housing more affordable, do we need to choose between building a lot more homes and reducing migration levels? But firstly, it's important to understand what is actually happening to migration levels in the UK. When the UK left the EU in 2021, it ended free movement of labour, and migration from Europe has definitely fallen. However, there's been a significant rise in migration from non-EU countries. This is mainly due to work visas and student visas. Also, the figures for last year were boosted by the arrival of 174,000 people from Ukraine, likely to be a one-off event. Last year was also exceptional because of record numbers of students moving into the UK because of the end of COVID. So in the next few years, net migration levels will definitely come down, as other immigrants who came in will leave, especially those on student visas. But importantly, it will still remain very high. The last census of 2021 found that 50% of the increase in the UK's population came from immigration, with 10 million foreign-born people amongst a population of 60 million in England and Wales. As a side note, the number of those coming on cross-channel boats is around 46,000 for last year, an insignificant fraction of overall housing demand, though it has been placing costs on local councils. The rise in net migration has been one factor in increasing overall housing demand. It's one of the largest components of a rising number of households, and this is especially an issue in the private rented sector because recent migrants are much more likely to be in private rented sector and not home owners. Levels of migrants with subsidised social housing tend to be at a similar rate to those of native-born people. Since the early 1990s, the average price of houses in the UK has soared faster than incomes, faster than inflation, and faster than similar European countries. And in late 2022, it had reached levels of unaffordability never seen before, with house prices up to 9 times average incomes, out of the reach of most young people. Rents have also risen very rapidly, and combined with low real income growth in the past decade or so, it's put a lot of upward pressure on housing costs, as people face an increasing share of income having to be put into housing. But the big question is, to what extent can these rise in housing costs be directly attributed to immigration? In 2018, the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government used a model from the University of Reading which suggested for a 1% rise in households would lead to a 2% rise in house prices. Therefore, if we take the nearly 5 million increase in foreign-born households between 1991 and 2016, it means immigration could be responsible for an estimated 21% increase in house prices over this period. Now, if this model is true, and there are reasons to be sceptical of it, which we'll come to later, but if it is true, in 2022, with net migration of around 600,000, being around 1% of the UK population, this suggests that net migration is responsible for house price inflation being, say, 2% higher than it otherwise would have been. The nationwide say that house price inflation in the UK is minus 5%. So without net migration, prices may have fallen by 7%. However, there are a number of caveats to this analysis which need some explanation. Firstly, this study used by the government in that case is on the more extreme edge of a link between migration and house prices. The Migration Observatory point to 3 studies which suggest a relationship between immigration and house prices of 1% rise in immigration leading to 1% rise in prices. With a UK population of around 67 million, and assuming that net migration levels off at around 300,000, around 0.4% of the population, then this would be causing house price inflation of 0.4% per year. Not that much, but still significant if you compound it over many years. Also, there are other things to consider. The average household size in the UK has been falling in recent years. It's now about 2.34, but recent migrants tend to live in greater housing density with bigger household sizes. Also, on a very local level, some studies suggest that highly concentrated levels of migration can actually lead to lower house prices in that region, because the high levels of migration can cause high income earners to move out and actually depress prices. On the other hand, migration has been much highest in London area, but London is also one of the areas with the most inelastic supply, where it's the most difficult to build new houses. So the impact on migration in London, it will be greater than elsewhere in the country where it's easier to build supply. Another factor is that although the UK is very bad at building new homes, one of the constraints of building new houses is actually a lack of skilled labour. The UK has become very good at producing graduates, but not very good at producing bricklayers. And industries have called for more migration of skilled labour to help the construction industry build more houses. Another factor is that since a high share of net migration is with regard to student visas, this means the impact has been much greater on student accommodation. And in recent years, the cost of student rent has been soaring. All studies do suggest that it's quite difficult to provide an exact answer of how much immigration directly affects house prices and rents, because there are so many moving factors and it's difficult to isolate them. However, the more unresponsive supply is, then the greater impact migration has. And given that the UK has a widely accepted shortage of housing, one of the lowest home vacancy rates in Europe, and frequently failing to meet housing supply targets, then high levels of net migration, at the very least, will put upward pressure on house prices and rents. But to give a sense of perspective, how does the effect of migration compare to other factors like supply, real interest rates, and real incomes? One study by Hilber and Vermeulen, 2014, suggested house prices in England would have risen by 100% less in real terms from 1974 to 2008, if hypothetically all planning regulations had been removed. Now, this is very hypothetical and there's no political reality where we would remove all planning regulations, but it does show that the shortage of supply is a big factor. Also, the Migration Advisory Committee found that the impact of migration on house prices was much larger in those local authorities which have the most restrictive planning practices. Another big factor driving house prices, especially in the past decade, has been a period of ultra-low interest rates. Between 2009 and 2022, this distorted the market. Despite very weak real wage growth, house prices soared because mortgages were so cheap. This caused the record rise in house prices and house price to income ratios, and this was the main driver of house prices, not levels of migration. And as interest rates have gone up quite sharply recently, prices have started to come down, although the only modest falls in prices suggest interest rates have a time lag and other factors are still at play. Also, given that most of the recent migration ends up in the private rented sector, at least recent migrants, the impact on migration is bigger in the private rented sector than in the housing market. And it is a real problem for the UK that the supply of private rented accommodation is not keeping up with demand, and we would have to build a lot more, and also specifically for rent, to address some of the problems of high prices and people struggling to get any rented accommodation at all. A good question is that if immigration is placing more pressures on the UK housing market, why is it so high? And why does even a Conservative government allow such high levels of migration, given their emphasis on trying to reduce it? One answer is that business say they need more skilled labour. There's a shortage in the UK, and this has been exacerbated in recent years because there's been an increase in the number of people leaving the labour market, long-term sickness, early retirement, so there's a decline in participation and there's not enough skilled labour. On the one hand, immigration places more pressure on the NHS, but without immigration, the NHS would be even more severely understaffed. Around 16.5% of NHS staff report being a different nationality to British. With a lack of trained nurses and doctors, we rely on immigration to fill those important vacancies. The economic impact of immigration on wages and economic growth is worth a separate video in itself. But the point is that the UK, like most other European countries, do have a falling birth rate. We've got an ageing population, and the arrival of young immigrant skilled workers is helping to some extent offset this ageing population. And working migrants do tend to be net contributors to the Treasury because they pay income tax but don't receive pensions yet. You could argue that immigration plays a role in paying for our ageing population. If we were to weigh up the pros and cons on the economic effects of migration, there are quite a few pros, quite a few cons. But on the disadvantage side, there definitely is a trade-off between increasing our population through migration and the desire or unwillingness to build new houses. If migration keeps going at much higher levels, as has happened in recent years, there is an impact that we do need to build more houses. And that's a choice we're going to have to make. So immigration does affect the housing market, but it would be a mistake to label immigration as the biggest cause of a housing crisis, because house prices are really driven by interest rates, real incomes and supply. Immigration is a factor behind demand and the growing number of households, but it is superseded by real wages and interest rates. Even if we cut immigration sharply over the next few years, it would take quite a few years for it to be really noticed in terms of prices. So immigration does have an impact on the housing market, and it probably affects the young, low-income workers more than anybody else. And is there any hope that UK house prices will fall? To what extent are they overvalued? This video goes into more detail, looking at all the factors affecting the valuation of UK houses and whether they will fall.